Ethan Rocha moved into the cul-de-sac expecting peace. Nothing more, nothing less. After selling his tech startup, he traded late-night coding marathons and boardroom warfare for a quiet street, freshly cut grass, and the comfort of anonymity. The houses were nearly identical, beige with blue shutters, perfectly trimmed lawns, and American flags swaying just enough to be picturesque. It was the kind of neighborhood that seemed to whisper, "Nothing bad happens here." The Homeowners Association, HOA, greeted him with a welcome packet and a long list of regulations, many of which felt unnecessarily strict. No decorative wind chimes. Trash bins must be hidden at all times. Exterior lighting must conform to HOA-approved models. Still, Ethan didn't mind. He had lived under worse rules in the tech world. What he didn't anticipate was the unspoken power structure. A thin, sharp line of control drawn by one woman, Karen Ellison. Karen wasn't elected. She installed herself into every committee, every decision, every neighborhood conversation that mattered. She knocked on doors uninvited, kept spreadsheets of minor infractions, and made it her personal mission to enforce order at any cost. No mailbox survived without her approval. She treated violations like personal attacks and infractions like acts of war. Most neighbors avoided conflict, nodding in silence when she passed. Ethan at first did the same. That changed the morning his first mailbox was crushed. It happened on a Wednesday morning, early enough that the sun had barely crept above the rooftops. Ethan walked outside, coffee mug in hand, expecting to grab his mail and breathe in a rare moment of quiet. Instead, he found shattered splinters of wood strewn across the driveway. His mailbox, once standing proud with a brushed aluminum plate and custom numbers, now lay in ruin, bent, broken, and half-buried in tire tracks that veered slightly onto his lawn. He stared at it in disbelief. There were no notes, no witnesses, no apologies. Just damage and silence. At first, he thought it might have been a delivery truck or a reckless driver cutting too close. So he did what most would, he replaced it. A new one, nothing fancy. Basic steel, standard size, neutral color. Compliance-friendly choice. But something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't the mailbox. It was the lack of surprise. The faint expectation in the air. Like everyone already knew this was just the beginning. Later that afternoon, Ethan mentioned it casually to his next-door neighbor, a quiet middle-aged man who had lived there for over a decade. The response came with a glance over the shoulder, voice low. Karen doesn't like modern designs, or creativity, or people who don't ask first. He followed it with a half-joking, half-terrified chuckle. You're new, so she's testing you. You'll get used to it. Or you'll move. That was when Ethan realized this wasn't a fluke. It was a message. But Ethan wasn't wired for submission. Not after years of startups, acquisitions, and negotiating with billionaires. He didn't react, not yet. He just took note. Like any good engineer, he began to collect data. And quietly, beneath the surface of his calm suburban smile, the code of retaliation began to write itself. Karen didn't need a throne. She ruled from the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, dressed in beige slacks and sunglasses big enough to shield her from accountability. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Her power came in form letters, obscure rules, and concerned neighbor emails sent at 3 a.m. She smiled when she fined you. She regretted your noncompliance while slipping a warning into your mailbox about the color of your porch lights. Ethan observed her closely over the next few weeks. She patrolled like clockwork. Every Tuesday and Saturday morning, walking the neighborhood like a self-appointed general. He noticed she would slow down whenever she passed his house, making a point to inspect the new mailbox with a tight smile and a too-long glance. She never addressed the first incident, never mentioned the broken one. But every look said it all. You've been warned. Her emails began shortly after. First, a gentle reminder that exterior fixtures needed approval. Then, a follow-up about vehicle positioning in his driveway. Finally, a veiled accusation about a potentially reflective material on the mailbox surface. Ethan responded politely, firmly, with citations of HOA bylaws and screenshots of approved designs. She replied with silence, until mailbox number 2 was destroyed. This time, the tire marks were unmistakable. Wide, deep, and angled directly across the curb. Ethan took photos. He checked nearby cameras. Nothing. No street-facing angles captured the hit, and once again, no note was left. Karen passed by later that day, sipping from a tumbler that matched her pastel sweater, and offered a single word with a smile. Unfortunate. By the time Ethan installed his 5th mailbox, he had stopped pretending it was just coincidence. The first 2 had been standard designs, the 3rd slightly reinforced, and the 4th mounted on a metal post. Each one lasted less time than the one before. Every destruction came without warning, without admission, and always under the cover of darkness or early dawn. The 5th stood tall for exactly 9 days before it, too, was crushed, this time bent backward at an unnatural angle, as if someone had aimed for it deliberately. Each time, Ethan filed formal complaints with the HOA. Each time, Karen responded with icy professionalism. While we empathize with your situation, the HOA cannot be held responsible for unidentified property damage. Attached were PDFs of local statutes, HOA bylaws, and helpful suggestions to consider placement further from the curb to avoid accidental contact. It was a masterclass in avoidance, weaponized bureaucracy dressed in concern. Neighbors began to notice. One waved awkwardly from across the street while walking her dog. Another slipped a note into Ethan's door late at night. "You're not crazy." She did the same thing to the Millers before they moved. But no one wanted to speak out publicly. Fear, Ethan realized, was just another part of her system. Keep everyone afraid. Keep the rules vague. Keep control. But Ethan wasn't afraid, he was intrigued. Where others saw bullying, he saw a pattern. Where others gave up, he got creative. The 5th mailbox wasn't just another loss. It was the last straw, and the spark of an idea far more sophisticated than concrete and nails. It was time to build something Karen would never see coming. The first step in Ethan's plan was simple: verify the obvious. After mailbox number 5 was obliterated, he walked the neighborhood, tracing possible camera angles. There were doorbell cams, some angled poorly, others conveniently offline. He asked a few neighbors politely if their security systems had caught anything. Some shook their heads. Others avoided eye contact. One man, pale and jittery, simply said, "We've learned it's better not to get involved." Ethan checked with the HOA's community surveillance system, allegedly installed to ensure neighborhood safety. He submitted a formal request to view footage from the night his mailbox was damaged. Karen's reply was lightning fast and full of legal smoke. Due to privacy protections, HOA video access is restricted to board-approved investigations. Unfortunately, your request does not meet the criteria for internal security review. In other words, you don't get to see what we see. The pattern was clear. Cameras that should have recorded something, anything, conveniently failed, glitched, or were ruled inaccessible. Ethan even noticed that Karen's own home had multiple visible cameras, yet none pointed toward the street. They pointed inward, defensive, as if she were afraid someone might do to her what she had done to others. The idea made him smile. That night, Ethan made a decision. If no one else would show the truth, he would record it himself. But not with standard gear. Not with another vulnerable mailbox on a stick. No, he'd build something smart. Something advanced. Something that would record, resist, and respond. The kind of solution a software engineer would design if he were going to war with suburbia's tyrant. The phrase became a running joke in Ethan's house. "It must have been the wind." That's what Karen had said, verbatim, in her final HOA reply after mailbox number 5 was found split in half and halfway across the yard. "Perhaps a storm came through overnight," she had written with faux concern. The weather report from that night? Clear skies, zero wind, not a leaf out of place. Her sarcasm was a sword wrapped in silk. Ethan printed that phrase and taped it above his workbench in the garage, a motivational poster for what was to come. He began sketching ideas on a whiteboard, diagrams that looked more like military schematics than suburban landscaping. He wasn't just rebuilding a mailbox. He was designing a smart defensive system, something that would make DARPA engineers raise an eyebrow. The goal wasn't violence. It was exposure. Proof. Checkmate. He gathered materials. Reinforced steel, concrete mix, vibration sensors, directional microphones, a wide-angle night vision camera, and a motion-triggered voice module. He even added a backup power supply to avoid tampering. Each piece was tested, adjusted, and integrated with a private server that would auto-upload footage in real time. Then came the psychological component, the message. A voice, modified slightly for dramatic effect, recorded in his calmest tone. Smile for the court. You are being recorded in 4K. The project took 3 nights of work, 6 cups of coffee, and 1 broken drill bit. When it was done, he called it the MBOX Sentinel. To a casual passerby, it looked like a modern, minimalist mailbox. Clean lines, matte black finish, HOA compliant in every visual way. But beneath that surface lay enough tech to catch a government agent off guard. He installed it at dawn, calmly, without ceremony. And then he waited, not with hope, but with certainty. Because wind doesn't leave tire tracks. The day before installing the MBOX Sentinel, Ethan decided to pay one final visit to the local police department. Not because he expected justice, but because he knew how narratives were built. It was a small, unimposing station tucked between a bank and a coffee shop, where the officer at the front desk looked more bored than busy. Ethan brought a folder photos of every destroyed mailbox, the HOA correspondence, and a printout of Karen's now infamous wind response. He explained everything calmly. The pattern of destruction, the timing, the denials, the HOA's interference. The officer, Officer Myers, nodded politely, but with the glazed expression of someone hearing about a neighbor's barking dog. Any witnesses? He asked. No, Ethan said. Any security footage? Not yet, but that's going to change. Myers shrugged. Sounds like a civil issue. You could take it to small claims if you have proof. But without video, our hands are kind of tied. That was exactly what Ethan had expected to hear. He thanked the officer, left a copy of the report, and walked out. On the surface, the trip was pointless. But now there was a record, an official timestamp showing he'd tried to resolve things peacefully. If what he anticipated happened next, no one could say he hadn't warned them. The legal dominoes were being set one piece at a time. Back home, he sent the final lines of code to his home server. Live feed testing passed. Audio trigger calibration passed. Uplink redundancy passed. The Sentinel was live, and soon someone was going to walk, or drive, straight into it. This time, Ethan wasn't hoping justice would come. He had engineered it himself. The very next day, as if on cue, Ethan received a new letter from the HOA. It was hand-delivered, sealed with the signature HOA watermark, and printed in that sterile, corporate font design to make threats feel official. The subject line? Mailbox non-compliance. Immediate correction required. Ethan read it slowly, then read it again, half laughing, half disbelieving. The mailbox he had installed was well within regulations. Its dimensions, materials, and placement all matched the approved guidelines. The only thing not on paper was that it was built to withstand a missile. The letter accused him of unauthorized alterations and non-aesthetic alignment with the neighborhood's visual standard. Karen had signed it herself. No inspection report. No technical violations. Just a vague condemnation and a veiled threat of fines if the situation is not remedied within 48 hours. It wasn't about compliance. It was about control. And the fact that Ethan had built something she hadn't approved drove her mad. He posted the letter to a private forum he'd created, a place where his fellow neighbors, fed up with HOA intimidation, could vent anonymously. The post caught fire. Within hours, 5 other residents shared similar notices they'd received over the years. One had been fined for a faded fence panel that was brand new. Another had been warned about a disharmony in mailbox finish tone. Karen's tyranny, once whispered about behind hedges, was now documented in digital ink. That night, Ethan stood at his window with the lights off, sipping tea, watching the MBOX Sentinel through the blinds. He didn't need a gun. He didn't need backup. He had a trap built on code, precision, and patience. He'd done everything by the book except he wrote his own book. The system had mocked him, dismissed him, laughed in his face. But the system had never faced someone who could out-engineer it. Ethan didn't seek vengeance in the traditional sense. There were no threats, no angry confrontations, no revenge notes stuck in mail slots. His retribution came in the form of algorithms, encrypted backups, and quietly activated sensors embedded in what looked like a perfectly ordinary mailbox. He spent years writing code that controlled drones, data systems, and surveillance AI for government contracts. Now, all of that experience was focused on one suburban corner and one very specific SUV. He programmed the MBOX Sentinel to detect the make, model, and even license plate of Karen's vehicle. Using an optical sensor embedded in the mailbox frame, the system would scan approaching cars and remain silent, unless it recognized the signature profile of her vehicle. Only then would the internal systems come to life. The camera would record at 4K resolution, the directional microphone would engage, and the motion speaker would activate with its now iconic line. "Smile for the court. You are being recorded in 4K. But it wasn't just about capturing the act, it was about escalation. Ethan installed a cloud-based auto backup system that would immediately store footage in multiple private drives and email a copy to himself. He even created a dead man's switch. If the mailbox was destroyed and the main system severed, the last 60 seconds of footage would be instantly uploaded and preserved. This wasn't a trap. It was a warning shot wrapped in hardware. The night before everything changed, Ethan stood in the driveway under a pale moon. The air was still. His house lights were off. The neighborhood slept. But he didn't. He stood beside the MBOX Sentinel, hand resting lightly on its frame, and whispered, "One more step, Karen. Just one." His words weren't angry. They were calm, focused. He wasn't fighting out of spite anymore. He was reclaiming his space, digitally, legally, and absolutely. Long before the first piece of steel was cut, the MBOX Sentinel existed in Ethan's mind, fully formed, line by line, function by function. He didn't sketch it like an artist. He engineered it. Blueprints covered one wall of his garage. System architecture diagrams, thermal dissipation models, camera sightlines, and antenna placement layouts. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore. It was a quiet rebellion, cast in metal and wrapped in circuitry. He started with the core, a steel-reinforced inner housing surrounded by high-density foam, designed to absorb shock without disrupting internal electronics. Then came the sensor array, pressure pads under the base, proximity detectors calibrated to identify vehicle movement within 3 feet, and a dual-angle night vision camera set behind mirrored glass. The whole system was controlled by a custom-built microcontroller Ethan had designed himself, with just enough AI to identify behavioral patterns. The software was equally intricate. The Sentinel system ran a lightweight Linux OS configured for silent operation and full automation. It didn't need constant supervision. If tampered with, it would lock its storage, upload the last 2 minutes of footage, and send real-time alerts to Ethan's phone with GPS-tagged data. And of course, the piece de resistance, the speaker module. He adjusted the frequency to carry across an open street, calm but chilling. "Smile for the court. You are being recorded in 4K. He finished the blueprint and taped it above his workbench, next to Karen's letter and a printout of her wind excuse. As he stared at the finished design, he didn't feel rage or adrenaline. He felt the slow burn of precision. This wasn't about revenge. It was about correction, the rebalancing of a system that had long been twisted in silence. And when the moment came, every screw, every sensor, every line of code would speak for itself. The garage became Ethan's sanctuary. By day, he waved to neighbors and pretended to mow the lawn. By night, he forged armor. Steel plates, cut with a plasma saw, were welded into a core skeleton designed to look like a standard mailbox but built to endure a war zone. Reinforced concrete filled the base, poured with surgical precision into a mold he 3D printed himself. The whole unit weighed over 200 pounds, but from the curb, it looked sleek, modern, and completely HOA compliant. The sensors came next. Ethan embedded micropressure plates beneath the box's structure, tuned to detect the subtle tremors of approaching vehicles. A gyroscopic sensor inside the post would record tilt, angle, and impact in real time. He installed a 360-degree night vision camera within a weatherproof housing, its lens barely the size of a dime. There were no blinking lights, no obvious indicators. That was the point. You wouldn't know you were being watched until it was too late. Inside, the AI system slept, waiting. It didn't react to kids on bikes or neighbors walking dogs. It knew what to look for. The mass and shape of an SUV, the slow crawl of a driver scoping the curb, the telltale vibration of a vehicle nosing too close. When that sequence was detected, the system woke up, quietly recording, analyzing, and triggering the audio warning at the exact moment it would have the most psychological impact. But beneath all the wiring, welding, and code, what really powered the Sentinel was something else. Anger held in perfect stillness. Ethan didn't pace. He didn't rant. He just worked. Each turn of the wrench another chapter in his silent protest. His war wasn't against chaos. It was against smug, bureaucratic tyranny wrapped in smiles and pastel sweaters. He didn't want to destroy Karen. He wanted to expose her. And he'd built the perfect trap to do it. The first time the voice activated, Ethan was watching from his second-story window, a silent sentinel himself. It was late, close to 2 a.m., when the familiar SUV crept down the street. Headlights off. No brake lights. Slow, deliberate. Karen had done this before. The quiet hour. The calculated drive-by. But this time the trap was set. She rolled to a stop directly in front of his driveway. Her silhouette moved slightly in the driver's seat, craning forward, squinting at the new mailbox. Maybe she thought it looked too sturdy. Maybe she didn't like its design. Maybe she simply couldn't stand the idea of someone building something without her permission. The SUV inched forward, tires scraping the curb. That's when it happened. The audio cue triggered automatically. No delay. No warning. Smile for the court. You are being recorded in 4K. The voice echoed through the still night like thunder. Karen slammed the brakes. The SUV jolted. For a second, she didn't move, paralyzed in the driver's seat. Then, in a panic, she hit the gas and jerked the wheel too sharply. The front bumper clipped the side of the mailbox, and the full weight of her vehicle collided with the steel and concrete post. Her car crunched. The Sentinel didn't move an inch. Inside, Ethan watched the whole thing unfold in crystal clarity. Live footage streaming to his phone, every frame stored in multiple cloud backups. He didn't grin. He didn't cheer. He simply whispered, "There it is." The trap had sprung. The footage was perfect. And for the first time, Karen saw the one thing she couldn't control, herself caught in the act. The morning after the collision, the entire cul-de-sac buzzed with whispered speculation. Karen's SUV sat crooked in her driveway. The front bumper cracked and zip-tied together with what looked like a desperate patch job. She didn't come out to walk her dog. She didn't do her usual power stroll with a clipboard. She was silent, for once. And the silence was louder than any threat she'd ever issued. But Karen wasn't the type to retreat forever. 3 nights later, she came back. Ethan knew it would happen. Narcissists don't process defeat. They rationalize it. He was ready. The MBOX Sentinel had been upgraded. He'd added a second camera with infrared overlay, a new motion detection routine to isolate license plates in low light, and a live audio link he could activate from his phone. At 1:47 a.m., her SUV appeared again. This time she stopped farther down the block, lights off, and walked toward the mailbox on foot. A flashlight in one hand, a wrench in the other. Subtlety was gone. This was desperation. She knelt beside the box, examining it like a burglar studying a safe. Then she reached out to loosen one of the bolts. That's when Ethan triggered the speaker manually. "This is your second warning. Tampering has been recorded. Authorities have been notified." Karen leapt back like she'd been electrocuted. The wrench clattered to the sidewalk. She looked around, eyes wild, scanning the shadows for someone, anyone watching. But no one came out. No lights turned on. Just a single porch camera light flickered across her stunned face as she turned and ran. Ethan didn't call the cops. He didn't need to. He already had everything he needed. The neighborhood didn't sleep through this one. It was 2:12 a.m. when Karen made her final move. Whether it was rage, arrogance, or the belief that no one would dare stop her, she climbed back into her damaged SUV and floored it toward the MBOX Sentinel. Maybe she thought brute force would succeed where subtle sabotage had failed. Maybe she thought Ethan would back down if she escalated. But she underestimated one thing: the resolve of a man who'd built something to last. The impact was violent and immediate. Tires screeched. Metal twisted. The front end of Karen's vehicle crumpled as it slammed into the reinforced base. The mailbox didn't move, not an inch. The SUV, however, bounced backward with a dull, mechanical groan and a hiss of fluids leaking onto the pavement. The entire cul-de-sac lit up. Porch lights, motion sensors, phones blinking to life. Curtains parted. Doors cracked open. And in the glow of street lamps, they all saw her. Karen sat behind the wheel, dazed, her airbags deployed. Her door opened slowly. She stumbled out, looking not at the mailbox, but at the eyes watching from porches and windows. For years, she had ruled the neighborhood through intimidation and paperwork. But tonight, her reign ended in a display of pure, undeniable physics and cold digital justice. Ethan stood on his lawn, arms crossed, phone in hand. No anger in his face. No satisfaction either, just the calm of inevitability. One by one, neighbors emerged. No one said anything. No one needed to. The mailbox stood untouched, unbent, almost defiant. And Karen, surrounded by the people she'd bullied for years, finally understood. She had lost. Not in a meeting, not on paper, but in plain sight. By sunrise, the cul-de-sac looked like the aftermath of a war fought quietly in the dark. Karen's SUV had been towed before dawn, though not before a few residents snapped photos. The oil stain on the street remained, a greasy scar marking where the final act of defiance had failed. Her front yard lights were off, blinds drawn. Silence radiated from her house like a shameful aura. And in the center of it all, the MBOX Sentinel stood perfectly upright, untouched, its matte surface gleaming in the early light. Ethan received the footage automatically. Multiple angles, real-time diagnostics from the pressure sensors, even audio recordings of the crash, the screech, the crunch, the hiss of coolant. He reviewed it all like a forensic analyst. Nothing was left to interpretation. The data was precise, time-stamped, stored, and mirrored across 3 cloud drives. He printed copies of the sensor logs and still frames of Karen's impact, added them to the growing folder of evidence, and calmly labeled it. Incident 6, confirmed hostile intent. Later that afternoon, a representative from the HOA arrived. Not Karen, of course, but a young man named Chris who looked more like an intern than an enforcer. He knocked timidly, holding a clipboard and visibly sweating. "Hi, Mr. Rocha. We're doing a routine inspection of community infrastructure. I was asked to check on the mailbox situation." Ethan smiled, calm and professional. "Oh, happy to help. Want to see the footage?" Chris blinked. "Footage?" Ethan handed him a USB drive and a printed report. "Here's everything. Let me know if you need the impact telemetry." Chris didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. He just took the documents, nodded, and walked back down the driveway like someone who had just realized they were working for the wrong people. Ethan closed the door without another word. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to fight. He had let the truth do all the damage. Ethan had already won the real battle, but it wasn't enough that Karen knew it. The neighborhood needed to know. The world needed to see what unchecked authority looked like when exposed by patience and precision. So he compiled everything. High-definition footage from multiple angles, audio of the crash, sensor data, a timeline of the events, and even the HOA's written threats. He edited the video like a short documentary, concise, factual, and absolutely damning. He uploaded it to a private channel titled HOA Enforcement: When Control Becomes Destruction. Within hours, the video was shared in local community forums. Then it spread to subreddit threads for HOA horror stories. A few neighbors quietly messaged him, "I always knew she was behind it. You did what we were too scared to do." The views climbed quickly, and soon local reporters began reaching out. One even called the Mailbox a suburban symbol of resistance. Karen, meanwhile, remained silent. No public statements. No denials. Her SUV repairs had become the talk of the block, and her social media profiles were suddenly locked down. The HOA stopped issuing citations. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt unmonitored, liberated. Ethan wasn't hailed as a hero. He didn't want to be. But people now spoke more freely, waving as they passed, no longer glancing nervously toward her house. But Ethan had one more move. He submitted the footage and all evidence to a local investigative podcast known for exposing community corruption. The host replied personally, thanking him and promising a full feature. As he closed the laptop, Ethan leaned back in his chair. He hadn't just recorded justice. He'd broadcast it, and with the truth finally in the open, the power Karen once held had disintegrated into pixels and silence. The next few days brought a strange, quiet shift in the air. Like a storm had passed, but the trees were still adjusting. Ethan noticed the difference immediately. The polite nods from his neighbors turned into actual conversations. People who once hurried past his driveway now lingered, curious, hesitant, then finally bold enough to speak. Was it really her? An elderly woman asked while walking her dog. Did she really hit it on purpose? A young couple whispered while picking up their mail. Ethan didn't gloat. He answered simply, "The evidence speaks for itself." Then the floodgates opened. One by one, neighbors began sharing their own stories. Fines that made no sense. Violations that came with no proof. Complaints ignored. One man described being reported for excessive bird feeder activity. A woman admitted she was once threatened with legal action for putting a gnome in her garden. The absurdity wasn't new. What was new was that someone had finally stood up. A small group formed one evening on Ethan's lawn. Folding chairs, quiet voices, and guarded optimism. Do we have any recourse? What would it take to call a vote? Can we change the board? Ethan didn't offer to lead. He didn't need to. He simply laid out the process, the bylaws, and the loopholes Karen had used and how to undo them. Information became liberation. It was no longer just about a mailbox. It was about a community waking up from a long, oppressive slumber. The seeds of resistance had been planted in concrete and steel. Now they were starting to grow. The HOA had always been a tight ship, at least from the outside. Its rules were enforced with mechanical precision, and its board meetings were more performance than policy. But once Ethan's video reached the community, the illusion of unity began to crack. Residents began showing up to the meetings, not to listen but to challenge. And for the first time, the board wasn't prepared for the questions. At the next gathering, the room was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls. The agenda was printed and posted, but no one cared about shrub height or seasonal flags. They wanted answers. Why was there no investigation into the repeated property damage? Why are surveillance requests always denied? Why is Karen allowed to issue citations alone? Faces that once nodded in agreement now frowned in skepticism. The spell had broken. Some board members grew visibly uncomfortable. One of them, Linda, the treasurer, spoke softly but clearly. I never approved those citations. I didn't even know about them until after they were mailed. Another board member, Greg, flat out said he'd never seen footage from the community cameras, despite Karen claiming otherwise. The room buzzed. For the first time in years, Karen was being outnumbered publicly. She tried to regain control. She cited rules. She raised her voice. But the louder she got, the more people pulled away. Her power had never been formal, it was psychological, rooted in fear and perception. And once exposed to the light, it shriveled. The board didn't dissolve that night, but something more important happened. It fractured. And those cracks would only grow. Ethan stood in the back, saying nothing, watching, waiting. He didn't need to lead the charge. He'd already set it in motion with silence, steel, and a camera lens. The next HOA meeting wasn't just attended, it was anticipated. Flyers had been quietly passed around, digital group chats formed, and neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in years now sat side by side, united by shared frustration. Folding chairs ran out. People stood along the back walls. A few even brought popcorn, as if expecting a spectacle. They weren't wrong. Karen entered late, dressed in her usual power uniform. Beige blazer, oversized sunglasses, and a manila folder clutched tight like a weapon. But this time, there was no nodding welcome, no reverent silence. Just a room full of eyes that had seen what she had done. She took her seat at the front, cleared her throat, and tried to open with the usual perfunctory greetings. No one clapped. No one smiled. Then Ethan stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He simply said, "I have something to share," and plugged a flash drive into the community center's AV system. The screen came alive with the now infamous footage. Karen's SUV creeping down the street, the impact, the warning voice, the aftermath. Then came clips of her previous visits, the letters, the timestamps, and a short montage of testimonies from residents who had been quietly targeted for years. For the first time, Karen looked cornered. She tried to interrupt. "This isn't illegal," but someone shouted, "Then explain the footage." Another yelled, "You cost me over $500 in bogus fines." Voices overlapped. The room erupted not in chaos, but catharsis. Years of resentment boiled over in a coordinated, furious wave. And for once, Karen couldn't spin the narrative. Her folder remained closed. Her voice trembled. She stood and left before the meeting even ended. And when the doors finally closed that night, no one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The HOA had changed. The dictator had lost her crown, not with a vote, but with a flash drive. 2 days after the explosive meeting, the inboxes of nearly every homeowner in the subdivision lit up with a subject line that simply read, "What else has she been hiding?" The email came from a burner address, untraceable, and signed, but its contents were far from vague. Attached was a compiled PDF of HOA meeting notes, internal policy decisions, expense reports, and annotated records. Most had never been seen by residents before. Many were stamped, "Board internal use only." Among them were receipts for questionable expenditures. Catered lunches billed to HOA funds, security installations at Karen's home without approval, and legal consultations with no documented cause. Each document was paired with footnotes and comments, written in a sharp, surgical tone. Note: no record of a board vote on this expense. Policy changed without community notice. Violation of Article 3, Section B. It was more than a whistleblower drop, it was a dossier, and it painted a picture of systematic abuse of authority. The neighborhood read it in stunned silence. And once again the whispers began. No one knew who sent it. Some assumed it was Ethan. But when asked, he simply smiled and replied, "Wouldn't know anything about that." The truth? It didn't matter. What mattered was that control had slipped from Karen's fingers, and now it was unraveling publicly. She tried to respond, sent her own email defending minor oversights and blaming miscommunication within the board. But the tone was off, defensive, desperate. For years, Karen had relied on apathy and fear to maintain control. But now she faced something far more dangerous. A neighborhood informed, connected, and done being silent. Conversations happened on sidewalks. Group threads grew by the hour. New leaders emerged. Not loud or flashy, just people with calm voices and clear eyes who asked the right questions. And all the while, Ethan watched it unfold. Not as the face of the movement, but as its quiet architect. It started with a retweet. A mid-sized local journalist, known for covering government waste and HOA abuse, stumbled upon the video Ethan had quietly uploaded. He shared it with the caption, "Man builds indestructible mailbox to stop HOA harassment, and it works. Must watch." Within minutes, it spread across community forums, then to Reddit, and finally to national platforms that fed on stories of suburban justice. By the end of the day, the video had 1.2 million views and climbing. Suddenly, the story had a name: the Karen Mailbox Saga. The comments poured in, some funny, some furious, many deeply empathetic. "This guy is Batman for HOA neighborhoods. My mom went through the same thing. This is justice." We need blueprints for the MBOX Sentinel. Immediately, local news stations requested interviews. HOA law experts dissected the legality. A segment aired during the evening news titled, Suburban Vigilance or Civil Disobedience? Karen's name trended regionally, and not favorably. Someone even created a meme page. By morning, her reputation had gone from feared community leader to national caricature. Her SUV, the one that crumpled against Ethan's mailbox, became a symbol. Screenshots of the impact were now stickers, GIFs, and even t-shirts. Karen tried to fight back. She threatened legal action for defamation, but every attempt backfired. The truth wasn't just out, it was documented, distributed, and democratized. She couldn't silence it because she had become a symbol of the very abuse people were tired of tolerating. And through it all, Ethan never stepped in front of a camera, never gave a statement. He didn't need to. His design, his restraint, his absolute command of evidence spoke louder than any interview ever could. The man behind the mailbox had done the impossible. Made the whole country care about one HOA too far gone. When the HOA bylaws were written, they were never meant to be read by millions. They were designed for quiet enforcement. Dense language, selective interpretation, vague clauses that gave the board unchecked power behind closed doors. But now, thanks to the viral explosion, those documents were under the microscope of an audience with lawyers, engineers, and everyday people who had also suffered at the hands of petty neighborhood tyrants. Internet sleuths went to work. Entire threads on Reddit and HOA watchdog forums began dissecting Karen's governance like a crime scene. They found discrepancies in the election procedures, loopholes that had been exploited, financial records that didn't align with official meeting minutes. Someone even cross-referenced property assessments and noticed Karen's own home had never received a citation in over 5 years. A statistical impossibility the HOA once feared had become a joke. Their form letters were shared and mocked. Old violations resurfaced. Residents started demanding refunds for unjust fines. A class action inquiry was casually suggested in one forum, and within 48 hours, a local attorney announced he was investigating the case pro bono. What began as a personal act of resistance was now public reckoning. The HOA board scrambled. An emergency meeting was scheduled. Damage control emails were sent, with carefully worded apologies and promises of greater transparency moving forward. But it was too late. The people no longer feared the board. They understood it. And worse for Karen, they no longer believed in it. The bylaws, once used as weapons, were now being rewritten by the very people they were meant to suppress. Ethan watched it all unfold with quiet clarity. He hadn't just designed a mailbox. He'd engineered a mirror, one that forced the community to see what it had tolerated for far too long. And now, with the world watching, the HOA couldn't hide behind paperwork anymore. Karen had never known defeat, at least not in this neighborhood. Her authority had always been absolute, bolstered by fear, silence, and just enough official jargon to keep everyone second-guessing themselves. But now, with her name dragged across headlines and hashtags, her SUV infamous, and her mailbox nemesis still standing unscathed, she faced something she never anticipated: irrelevance. She responded the only way she knew, by doubling down. At the emergency HOA meeting, she arrived early and alone, flanked by thick binders and her signature condescension. The room was fuller than ever. Neighbors who hadn't attended a single meeting in years were now seated, alert, and unafraid. Cameras from a local news station were set up in the back. Karen stood at the podium and began reading from a prepared statement. Her voice was sharp, mechanical. She blamed a coordinated defamation effort, spoke of malicious digital editing, and claimed the mailbox incident was an exaggerated moment of poor visibility. She called Ethan's video a performance and accused unnamed parties of manipulating public sentiment for personal gain. But as she spoke, the room remained silent, not out of respect, but from disbelief. When she finished, someone in the crowd asked calmly, "So, you deny hitting the mailbox?" Karen hesitated. It was dark. The street has poor lighting. Another voice, "We all watched the video." Then another, You tried to remove it with a wrench. That's on film too. And then someone laughed. Quiet at first, but it spread. Nervous chuckles gave way to full-on amusement. Not cruelty. Not mockery. Just the sound of a neighborhood finally recognizing the absurdity of the tyrant in their midst. Karen's face flushed. For the first time, she looked genuinely unsure. She closed her binder. She stepped away from the mic. She left the room. There was no official resignation. No dramatic walkout. Just a woman who realized that fear only works until it doesn't, and that the power she clung to was already gone. 3 days after her public collapse at the emergency meeting, Ethan received an envelope, certified, formal, and thick with the scent of desperation. Inside was a letter, printed on the letterhead of a local law firm notorious for representing HOA cases with aggressive flair. The tone was classic legal intimidation. Cease and desist, intent to pursue damages, defamation, emotional distress. In bold, it demanded the immediate removal of the viral video and a written public apology to Karen Ellison. Ethan read it twice, then a third time. No surprise, no anxiety, just amusement. He calmly forwarded the letter to his own attorney, a quiet, sharp-witted woman named Valerie, who specialized in civil liberties and digital rights. She took one look at the footage, documentation, and online chatter, then issued a response that was as cold and precise as the MBOX Sentinel itself. My client has not defamed anyone. My client has documented unlawful behavior on his own property. My client has exercised his right to safety, speech, and documentation. Should your client wish to proceed with legal action, we welcome discovery. The response was CC'd to the HOA board, a few local reporters, and, just for good measure, uploaded to the same digital folder that housed all previous incident records. Ethan didn't stop there. He added Karen's cease and desist letter to the ever-growing archive of HOA abuse, titled it Phase 2, Retaliation, and shared it with the neighborhood forum. The letter had the opposite effect Karen intended. Instead of silencing Ethan, it became proof of her continuing campaign, an act of legal bullying now visible to hundreds. Comments flooded in. She's really going out swinging, huh? A lawyer? After crashing into a mailbox? The audacity. Imagine trying to sue someone for proving you're guilty. Karen hadn't sent a lawsuit. She had sent her final threat, and just like the last 5 mailboxes, it crumpled on impact. While Karen reached for legal threats, Ethan reached for his keyboard. Not to fight, to build. Because that's what he did best. He wasn't interested in drama, lawsuits, or social media warfare. He knew that while the headlines would fade, systems remained, and systems, when flawed, needed fixing. So Ethan did what no one expected. He created a free, open-source version of the MBOX Sentinel blueprint and published it online under a quiet project name, Curb Guard. It wasn't just a design, it was a toolkit. A full PDF breakdown of materials, assembly instructions, wiring schematics, firmware source code, and even a legal FAQ explaining how to ensure it complied with local regulations. He included a message at the top. This is not for revenge. This is for peace of mind. Build responsibly. Document everything. Let truth protect you. The file went viral within 48 hours. Tech forums praised the clean coding. DIY YouTubers started building their own versions. Civil rights blogs called it a digital age David against a suburban Goliath. Even an engineer from a smart home security startup reached out privately, offering to partner on a commercial version. Ethan politely declined. He didn't want money. He wanted freedom for himself, for anyone who had ever been bullied under the guise of policy. Karen, meanwhile, had gone completely silent. No more emails. No appearances. Her home lights stayed off, blinds shut. But the neighborhood? It was alive again. People smiled when they passed Ethan's driveway. They asked questions about wiring, programming, housing materials. The mailbox had become a landmark, a symbol, yes, but also a blueprint for resistance. And Ethan? He just kept coding. Because his answer to control was never conflict. It was creation. The revolution didn't begin with fire. It began with conversations. Quiet, deliberate, and contagious. Ethan's actions had done more than stop a bully. They had cracked open a space where neighbors, long isolated by fear of fines and HOA scrutiny, started trusting each other again. Weekly sidewalk chats turned into backyard gatherings. The air shifted. People no longer whispered about infractions. They spoke openly about reform. What once felt like a rigid, rule-bound prison now felt like a neighborhood waking up. Inspired by Ethan's quiet defiance, several homeowners began organizing. They reviewed the bylaws, uncovered the loopholes Karen had abused, and proposed amendments. Petitions circulated, each signature a tiny rebellion against the tyranny they tolerated for too long. Residents volunteered to serve on the board, not out of ambition, but duty. People wanted fairness, transparency, and balance. The tipping point came when a respected, longtime resident, Mr. Diaz, a retired judge, publicly supported the recall motion. In a short speech at a community meeting, he said, "Rules exist to serve the community, not to suppress it." What Mr. Rocha did was not rebellion. It was protection of his property, of his rights, and, frankly, of all of ours. The vote passed in under 5 minutes. Karen was removed from her position. 3 other board members voluntarily resigned. A new, temporary leadership council was formed to rewrite the HOA's operating structure from scratch, with community input and full transparency. Ethan never ran for a position. He declined when asked. "I'm better behind the scenes," he said. "I build. You lead." But his mailbox remained exactly where it stood. Unmoved, unbroken, unchanged. A monument to accountability forged not through anger, but through methodical, intelligent resistance. The revolution wasn't loud. It didn't burn anything down. It simply built something better, and this time everyone helped. With the old board dismantled and the community energized, the HOA entered unfamiliar territory. Accountability. Meetings were now live-streamed, minutes publicly posted within 24 hours. Residents, once fearful of the slightest deviation from approved appearance standards, began suggesting changes, voting on real issues. Street maintenance, green space improvements, even a community garden. The rulebook that had once been weaponized became a shared blueprint for cooperation. But with reform came unexpected consequences. First, outside attention grew. HOA associations from nearby neighborhoods started reaching out, curious about the Rocha reforms. Some mocked, others admired. A few outright requested access to Ethan's curb guard specs and bylaw revision documents. He created a simplified guide, free to use, and posted it under Creative Commons licensing. It included a small dedication. For anyone who's ever been told to stay quiet, follow blindly, or park 1 inch too far from the curb. Second, Karen's absence left a strange vacuum. For some, it was a relief. For others, a curiosity. Rumors swirled that she had moved, that she was suing quietly, that she had relocated to another HOA where no one recognized her face. None of it mattered. What did matter was that her legacy of control had crumbled, and not with rage, but with design, evidence, and quiet resolve. Lastly, Ethan noticed something more subtle, his own transformation. He had never wanted to be a leader, but somehow, through restraint, innovation, and refusing to be broken, he had become a symbol, not just of rebellion, but of restraint with purpose. His mailbox hadn't just deflected impact. It had absorbed a community's fear and reflected back something better. One evening, a young neighbor approached him while he worked in his garage. "Hey, you think I could build one of those mailboxes too?" Ethan smiled. "Sure," he said, "but maybe you won't need to anymore." Her name was Monica Jameson, a nurse, a mother of 3, the kind of neighbor who always waved, always brought an extra chair to the block party, and never once attended an HOA meeting until things fell apart. But when the community began nominating candidates for the newly restructured board, her name kept rising to the top, not because she was the loudest, but because she listened. She didn't campaign. She simply walked the neighborhood with a clipboard and a calm presence. "What would you change if you could?" she asked. And people told her, "I just want to plant flowers without getting fined. I want to repaint my shutters without writing a letter. I want this place to feel like home again." On the night of the vote, Monica was elected unanimously. No drama, no objections, just quiet agreement that it was time for someone sane to lead. Her first meeting as HOA president lasted exactly 52 minutes. She read the agenda clearly, allowed every resident to speak, and then calmly announced her first official order. Effective immediately, all HOA citations issued under the previous administration will be reviewed for fairness and dismissed where no clear violation exists. Refunds will be processed where appropriate. No more vague language. No more intimidation. We're done with that. Applause erupted, small at first, then growing. Some clapped not just for the decision, but for what it meant. The end of a reign built on fear and the start of something better. Monica looked toward Ethan near the back of the room, gave a slight nod, and continued. After the meeting, she approached him privately. I read your guide. Twice. She said. I'm not techie, but I understood it. You didn't just protect your own yard. You gave people the tools to protect themselves. Ethan simply replied, I built a mailbox. The neighborhood did the rest. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood was quiet. Not the oppressive quiet of people walking on eggshells, but the peaceful quiet of a community finally at ease with itself. No more anonymous citations tucked into mailboxes. No more early morning compliance walks. No more neighbors nervously checking the color of their curtains or the length of their grass. There was laughter again. On porches, in driveways, across fences. People planted what they wanted in their gardens. Children chalked the sidewalks without fear of getting their parents fined. The energy had shifted from suspicion to solidarity. The fear was gone. Ethan returned to his routines. Late-night coding, long walks, occasional chats with curious kids asking, is that the famous mailbox? He had no interest in being a symbol anymore. He didn't give interviews. He declined speaking requests. He let the story fade into legend, right where it belonged. But the MBOX Sentinel stayed, still pristine, still functional, still watching, though no one had approached it in months. It had become part of the landscape, not as a warning, but as a reminder. That calm strength beats forced control, that design can speak louder than words, and that resistance doesn't have to look like fire. It can look like steel, code, and patience. One afternoon, Monica stopped by with a cup of coffee. We're putting together a community archive, she said, smiling. A real one. Honest history. I was wondering if we could include a photo of the Sentinel. You know, where it all turned around. Ethan chuckled. Sure. Just don't call it heroic. We won't, she said. We'll call it what it was. The moment we stopped being afraid. Years passed. The cul-de-sac grew quieter, not from fear, but from stability. Children who once watched Ethan work in his garage now rode bikes past the Sentinel without a second thought. New neighbors moved in, unaware of the battles that had once defined the street. The HOA evolved into something unrecognizable from its past. A body that served, not ruled. The bylaws were leaner, the rules clearer, and enforcement was a rare last resort, not a daily ritual. The MBOX Sentinel remained in place, untouched. Not because no one dared, but because no one needed to. It was no longer a trap. It was a symbol, subtle, clean, still functional, but no longer active. Ethan had deactivated the live feed system long ago. Peace didn't need surveillance. Peace just needed respect. Occasionally, letters still came, usually from strangers in other states, thanking him for the blueprint, for the idea, for proving that you could fight control without losing your soul. One came from a retired teacher in Arizona. I didn't build your mailbox, but I used your method. I documented. I organized. I stood up. Thank you. Another came from a widow in Missouri. You gave me permission to say no. That changed everything. Ethan never sought recognition, but in hardware and silence he'd left something behind. A new blueprint for defiance. Not loud, not angry, just steady, durable, concrete and code. On a spring morning, as light poured across the clean pavement, a neighborhood kid, probably no older than 9, paused on his scooter in front of the Sentinel. Hey! He called up to Ethan, who was watering his plants. Is it true that Mailbox stopped a car? Ethan smiled, eyes soft. It didn't stop a car, he said. It stopped the wrong kind of power. The boy blinked, then nodded, maybe not fully understanding, but feeling something true in it. And with that, he pushed off and rolled away, past the mailbox that never blinked, toward a street that finally belonged to its people.